Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some pretty serious claims. Claims that, well, if they were ever proven true, would be genuinely unprecedented in American politics.
Right.
We're looking at material built around a segment from Right-Wing News, which features an interview with Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. He's also a special contributor on Fox News, it seems.
Hmm.
And that segment references an article from Conservative Tribune and also brings in comments from former President Trump.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is how these sources float this idea, the possibility of a former president actually facing a felony indictment. They even frame it as bigger than Watergate.
Wow.
So
Okay.
our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is really to understand the specific claims being made in these sources. We want to explore the legal context they provide, look at the what-if scenarios they present, but stick strictly to the information in this material we have.
Got it.
We'll break down what's alleged, the reasoning they offer, and, the potential implications as laid out right there in the source.
All right, so the sources kick off with this really attention-grabbing idea of former president potentially facing a felony indictment. What's the initial setup? Why does right-wing news, according to the material, think this is even something to discuss?
Well, the right-wing news segment specifically names former President Obama as potentially being the first. The host, he calls himself the voice of reason in the clip.
Okay.
He makes a point of saying, look, an indictment is just a charge, it's not a conviction. And he pushes back against that common feeling that, nothing ever happens to politicians. He actually mentions Rod Blagojevich
Ah, yeah.
as a kind of counterexample, suggesting that sometimes consequences do happen.
And the sources seem to suggest that the political timing is really important here. Why would an indictment be potentially possible now, according to them?
That seems to be a really crucial part of their argument, yeah. The sources suggest that, well, while Obama was actually president, or, when Loretta Lynch was attorney general and the Hillary Clinton email situation was fresh, the idea is that nothing, quote unquote, lawful was going to happen then. The implication is that a different administration, specifically one where President Trump is calling for an investigation, creates a whole new environment where these kinds of actions might actually be pursued.
So a change in who's in charge opens the door, in their view.
Exactly. And the host of the segment, it's worth noting, expresses a very, very strong personal feeling he wants to see a conviction, even going so far as to fantasize about a customized 3x3 cell for Obama.
Okay, that's quite the statement. So then the sources shift focus to what they present as a really key development. Former President Trump's own claims about wiretapping. What exactly are those allegations as reported in the Conservative Tribune article?
So the Conservative Tribune piece, which Right-Wing News discusses, focuses on Trump's claims, specifically from Twitter, that President Obama had him wiretapped in Trump Tower before the 2016 election.
Right, I remember those claims.
The source does acknowledge up front that there isn't, quote, any concrete evidence just yet. But then it immediately pivots, claiming there's actually a lot more circumstantial evidence for that claim than, say, for the idea that Trump's campaign colluded with Russia.
And this is where Lieutenant Colonel Shaffer comes in and really raises the stakes, isn't it?
Yeah.
He says if this wiretapping allegation is true, it's huge.
Yeah. He uses the phrase, an order of magnitude bigger than Watergate.
Yeah.
He argues it would fundamentally change everything.
Why? What's the reasoning given in the sources for it being so much bigger than Watergate?
The core idea, as presented by Shaffer and echoed in the segment, seems to be about the misuse of governmental power. We're talking about nation-state resources, that's U.S. taxpayer money, government capabilities, being used not for legitimate national security, but for partisan political gain. Shaffer calls that street dictator behavior, a definite no, no, no. That's what elevates it, in their view, beyond just a political scandal.
So the allegation is using the state's tools for political targeting. How then do the sources argue a president could actually be indicted for something like that? What's the legal angle they propose?
They really zero in on this legal distinction between discretionary acts and ministerial acts.
Okay, what's the difference there?
So think of it like this. A president deciding whether to sign a piece of legislation, that's discretionary. It's about judgment, policy choice. Generally, you can't sue them later for that kind of decision. It's part of the job. Immunity applies.
Right.
But a ministerial act is different. That's something the law requires them to do under certain circumstances. Like, if fact A is proven, you must do action B. If they fail to do that required action, it's potentially problematic.
I see. So how does that apply to the alleged wiretapping?
The sources argue that ordering illegal surveillance for political reasons would fall outside the scope of legitimate presidential duties. It wouldn't be a discretionary act related to governing. It would be, effectively, acting outside the presidential role itself.
Ah. So abusing power for personal or political gain isn't covered by presidential immunity, according to this theory.
That's the linchpin, yes. They're suggesting that if he acted outside his official duties by misusing state resources this way, the usual rules of immunity just wouldn't apply. The source even adds commentary suggesting this fits a pattern, saying it's not unlike Obama to do it, and brings up alleged past actions like NSA spying or wiretapping reporters as supposed precedent.
So the source frames it not as a one-off, but maybe part of a pattern. And there's also a suggestion about assumptions. The host implies that maybe the Obama administration acted thinking Hillary Clinton would win in 2016.
Yes, the segment's host suggests that the widespread belief Clinton would win might have led them to think these alleged actions would, never see the light of day or face scrutiny under a different administration. It's speculation on motive, basically.
Yeah. Now, beyond the surveillance claims, the sources also bring up something else, right? Something about protests.
They do, yeah. It's a distinct claim, but brought up in the same right-wing news segment. It references former President Trump directly accusing Obama of being behind protests and even violence at GOP town halls.
Behind them how?
Trump specifically mentions an Organizing for Action group that Obama's head. And in a clip sourced from Fox and Friends, Trump apparently just says flat out, yep, he's behind it.
And how does the right-wing news host react to that?
Very strongly. He escalates that claim immediately to sedition, which is, a very serious legal term involving inciting rebellion against the government.
Sedition?
Yeah. And the host emphasizes that this is especially true when violence is involved, arguing that violence takes away anything that remotely resembles lawful protest or organizing.
That is a powerful accusation being made in the source material. So, given all these really serious allegations, the surveillance, the protests, the sedition claim, what's the overall takeaway from the sources? Do they think Obama will actually be the first president indicted for a felony?
Well, the host of Right Wing News puts it conditionally. He says if evidence surfaces, and if that investigation shows up, then he doesn't think Trump or Jeff Sessions would hesitate to prosecute.
Any sense of whether they think that evidence will surface?
The segment mentions some comments from Trey Gowdy after he spoke to then FBI Director Comey. Gowdy apparently said Comey stayed a lot longer than he was planning on, which the segment seems to interpret as implying something significant was discussed.
Okay, so hinting at something may be happening behind the scenes.
Right. The overall feeling conveyed in the source is that prosecution is possible, even though they acknowledge some people might be skeptical that Obama could ever face jail time. The host even speculates, again with very strong personal opinions, that Obama might try to flee to an extradition country and have Soros put him up somewhere, rather than face charges. It paints this picture of an ongoing evolution of Trump versus Obama, and the host encourages listeners to subscribe for news they claim the mainstream media won't cover.
So, a lot of speculation built on these claims.
Definitely. If we sort of step back and look at the big picture presented in these sources, they lay out this really significant claim, the potential for a former president to face a felony indictment.
Right.
And it's tied specifically to allegations of using state resources, government power for political gain, and even separate claims about being behind political actions and violence. The whole legal argument seems to hinge on that distinction we talked about, discretionary versus ministerial acts.
Yeah.
And the idea that actions outside the official scope of the presidency might mean immunity doesn't apply.
So, reflecting on all this for you, the listener, what does it all mean? We've walked through how these particular sources present the sheer gravity of these claims, comparing them to Watergate, suggesting precedents, outlining a legal path, however speculative. The entire premise really hangs on whether actual evidence for any of these claims emerges, and then, of course, whether there's the political will to actually pursue prosecution.
Which brings up a bigger question for you to think about. How do these kinds of discussions, even when they're based on allegations that are unproven, maybe even just circumstantial, as the source admits, how do they shape public perception of accountability, the balance of power in our system? What really stands out to you when you consider the possibility, however remote or evidence-dependent, of such high-stakes legal fights involving former leaders? Something to mull over.